Chapter 3. Nick Smith, an 11th-level human adventurer from America, glanced at his companions and asked Yolk how long they had been inside the dungeon. Yolk calmly replied that the question could mean either time relative to them or to the outside world. Garen shrugged and pointed out there was no real way to know either answer. Even if they had a timekeeper, it would be useless. Dustin added that the dungeon's temporal anomaly could add extra days outside depending on the dive's length, though he had also heard rumors of the opposite happening. Nif chuckled at the old saying that time flies when you're having fun while retrieving an arrow from a corpse. Mick sighed and finished wiping his blade clean after they had cleared waves of bugs, bots, goblins, harpies, sauroids, and hollows. Garen had been visibly on edge the entire time they fought the hollows, despite them being surprisingly easy thanks to Nick's steel bullet spell. Everyone agreed that even the toughest adventurer could have a phobia or two. This newest section of the dungeon had caught Dustin and Yolk completely by surprise, which in turn surprised the rest of the party. The monsters here were grotesque, mutated sacks of flesh straight out of a nightmarish survival game. They bled profusely, and bleeding them out seemed to be the only reliable way to kill them. Most lacked heads entirely, and even when one had a head, destroying it barely slowed the creature down. Nick discovered that spells summoning sharp, pointy objects worked best, so he switched to ice javelins and rock spears to conserve mana. Yolk, Larry, and Dustin experimented with different magic, while Garen's hammer proved less effective than Nick's sword at opening wounds. Garen still kept the creatures away from the rear line, giving the healers plenty of work. Korea wrinkled her nose at one of the twitching corpses and declared them far grosser than the earlier insect swarms. The creatures looked like someone had melted people into putty and haphazardly squished the pieces together. Hands were unnaturally long, feet too short, and skin varied from paper-thin to armor-thick in random patches. Faces, when they appeared at all, were contorted beyond recognition, making nostrils and eye sockets nearly indistinguishable. Nick couldn't help noticing that none of the twisted ears were pointed like an elf's would be. Garen shrugged and pointed out there were far fewer of them than the bug swarms, and they weren't particularly strong individually. Korea grumbled that they were still kicking his ass, prompting Garen to wink and admit he wasn't all that strong either. The party chuckled as hidden claws, bladed tongues, and randomly placed toothy maws kept every fight unpredictable. Each monster felt unique, forcing the group to adapt constantly. The dungeon walls themselves were even more disturbing than the monsters roaming them. Patches resembled skin, others raw muscle, and some defied identification entirely. Colors ranged from bright pink to deep, sickly blues and purples with streaks of green and brown. The constant pulsing and the context of the monsters made it clear this was living flesh, not some abstract painting. Korea finished healing Garen and smacked him on the back of the head for zoning out again. Nick shook himself, wondering how long he had been staring at the hypnotic walls. Garen asked what he had done wrong in a hurt tone that didn't sound entirely sincere. Korea explained that he had been taking minor wounds, scratches, bruises, and sprains since they broke camp that morning. Even small injuries added up, and Korea's magic core was running dangerously low. She announced they would have to rely on potions until they could rest properly. Yolk cautioned against sleeping in this area because the living walls and ceilings seemed to have a hypnotic effect. The Lich admitted he hadn't noticed the pull himself, likely due to his undead nature. Larry suggested they could counter the hypnosis if they identified the trigger, or he could simply stand guard while the others slept. Yolk warned that the hypnosis might have a point of no return with unknown, possibly nefarious purposes. Nick noticed Dustin, Nif, and Garen staring blankly at the walls and whistled sharply to snap them out of it. The three orcs jumped and immediately fixed their eyes on the floor. Yolk continued that in the worst case the hypnosis might force them to attack each other. Larry argued that fighting the area boss while exhausted would be suicide, especially since no records mentioned this place at all. Dustin agreed that an unknown section probably meant an unknown and likely deadly boss. Nick wondered silently if they had already reached the true end of the dungeon without realizing it. With no safe place to rest, the party pressed forward, eyes locked on the floor to avoid the walls. Squishing and slithering sounds soon announced another wave of flesh monsters. Nick opened with an ice javelin volley before switching to rock spears that punched bleeding holes in the creatures. The survivors were met by sword, hammer, arrows, and spells until everything lay in pools of blood. Nick grumbled at himself for not thinking of it sooner. then focused mana on his grimy cleaning cloth. Imagining the dirt separating from the fibers, he whispered the incantation, Seto Neo Sac. The grime flaked off instantly, revealing a new spell in his list called Clean Clothes. Yolk raised an eyebrow, concentrated on his own robe, and cast the same spell with dramatic results. A visible fog of centuries' worth of grime cascaded from Yolk's robe and settled on the floor. Beneath the filth, the robe everyone had always seen as brown was actually pristine white. The entire party stood speechless at the revelation of how dirty the Lich's trademark garment had been. Yolk happily declared that he would never have to choose between cleanliness and clothing again. After a couple more quick fights, the corridor widened into a vast chamber overgrown with pulsating bioluminescent flesh. In the center yawned a dark pit emitting squelching grunts and squeals. Nick silently prayed they wouldn't have to climb down after whatever lived inside. Garen complained about the grossness while Nick reminded him it could always be worse, like if everything was made of excrement instead. Arrows were knocked, necks were cracked, and the party advanced toward the pit. The sounds grew frantic until a blast of corpse-reeking air erupted upward. A needle-tipped tendril lashed at Nick's face. He sidestepped and severed it cleanly. An enormous pulsating bubble of flesh rose from the pit, revealing the boss. Nick fired a steel bullet that punched only a tiny bleeding hole in the massive creature. A bone mace tentacle whipped toward him faster than he could fully dodge and crushed his left arm. Pain flared, then dulled as Ten numbed it, and reported a dislocated elbow. Nick rolled away from follow-up strikes and slashed deep gashes that forced the tentacle to retreat. Spells and arrows riddled the boss with bleeding wounds while Larry healed both Nick and a badly slashed Garen. Ice spears shook loose as the creature screeched and retreated into the pit with a final squelch. Silence fell, and after tense moments, Nick peered over the edge into darkness. The party cautiously celebrated what seemed to be victory. Across the chamber, barely visible beneath the glowing flesh ceiling, stood a pair of smooth double doors with familiar Earth-style handles. Dustin remarked that no records mentioned this section or its monstrosities at all. Nick realized they had indeed cleared an unknown final area just as the higher one predicted. The revelation waited behind those impossible doors, followed by the confrontation they were supposed to flee. Nick told the orc party the fighting was over and they should head back. Garen stubbornly refused to abandon friends at the final stretch. After heated words, they shook on a compromise. The orcs would camp at the previous safe room and wait one full rest cycle. If Nick's group didn't return, Garen and his party would come looking, no matter what. Nick smiled and accepted the deal, knowing it kept his friends safely out of whatever came next.